By state law and county charter, I am both empowered and obligated to investigate the causes and circumstances of any death involving a member of law enforcement in the performance of their duties. Through a signed executive order, I have control over the inquest process, which has not been examined in a significant way since 2001. In 2015, I convened 2 inquests. In 2016, I convened 7. In 2017, I had to order 13 inquests, deaths that occurred in Auburn, in Federal Way, in Kent, in Burien, in Seattle. This sharp uptick may turn out to be a statistical aberration, but we all have every right to be concerned. The investigations and reviews that take place after officer-involved deaths must give confidence to the community that government takes it seriously when a life is taken by law enforcement. The inquest system was successful in providing a better understanding of the facts, but many people remain unsatisfied. And I believe it represented a lost opportunity to learn and to make improvements and create a more fair and transparent process. As I considered a new executive order governing inquests late last year, I convened a 6-person committee to review and re-examine the process. I want to thank our co-chairs, Faye Brooks and Sam Palka. I want to thank Rick Williams, Jeffrey Beaver, Davita Briscoe, and Judge Dean Lum for their hard work and their commitment. The committee brought its report to me in March. Soon after that, a group of law enforcement leaders and a community coalition of activists approached my office to advise and provide input. My staff and I met regularly with coalition members, with law enforcement leaders, with city officials to discuss new ideas. Ultimately, the coalition and law enforcement were not able to reach a final agreement, but the executive order I will sign today embraces many of the ideas that were brought forward by those community members. This new executive order makes significant reforms. A select group of pro tem judges will preside over inquests rather than district court judges. Families will be afforded attorneys through the Department of Public Defense if they want representation and have not hired an attorney of their own. I want to thank the King County Council for approving funding for that provision. Pro tem staff attorneys will assist the judge during the proceedings instead of the prosecuting attorney's office. Most important, the new executive order expands the fact-finding scope. Under the new system, a panel will now hear testimony about training and policies, and they will be asked whether the officer or officers followed them. This will help us better understand what happened and continue to improve. If police did not follow their training and departmental policies, we need to know why or why not, so that those departments can examine the work they're doing and make changes in the future that will prevent future tragedies. If police did follow training and protocol, we need to determine if there are improvements to be made to avoid a similar scenario in the future, and that opportunity then will be available to those agencies. The point is not to put an individual officer on trial. It is to make sure we are asking the right questions and taking appropriate actions. At the moment, we have 9 pending inquests. My goal is to begin this new process within the first quarter of next year. I believe the new executive order will provide families, law enforcement officers, and community members with greater transparency and accountability. I believe it will give the public more confidence in the legal system and will give law enforcement and policymakers greater ability to reflect on how training and policies come into play in difficult and confusing situations and how they might be improved. I want to thank the many people who contributed to this executive order. And I want to begin by introducing to you one of those main contributors, a retired chief of the County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigations Division and a co-chair of our committee, Faye Brooks.
So I'd like to first thank Executive Constantine for bringing us together today for the signing of this new executive order on inquests in King County. My name is Faye Brooks, and I retired as Chief of the Criminal Investigations Division with the King County Sheriff's Office after over 26 years of service. Today, I am a consultant specializing in police community relations, and I co-chaired the Executive's Inquest Review Committee. The Executive's Inquest Review Committee was charged with reviewing and re-examining the inquest process to determine what, if any, changes could or should be made to improve the process, both for the public and the affected parties. We approached our work with a guiding principle to recommend reforms that would make the process more transparent, fair, and meaningful for all parties, and I am proud of the process we engaged in as a committee. Throughout our process, we heard from numerous stakeholders that the current inquest process felt one-sided, that it wasn't actually building trust between community and law enforcement, and that there were common-sense reforms that could alleviate those tensions. We are here today to stand by Executive Constantine as he signs these common-sense reforms into law. I believe this new process is one that we can all be proud of. As a longtime law enforcement officer, I am heartened that this process brought community and law enforcement together to create positive change and instill trust in our public processes. I want to thank my fellow committee members who worked hard throughout this process, and I want to thank Executive Constantine again for his leadership on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. I'd like to now introduce Davida Briscoe, who's representing Not This Time.
Thank you, Executive. My name is Davida Briscoe. I am here representing Not This Time. We're a community-led organization that provides support services and advocates on behalf of families who have lost loved ones to law enforcement. We are focused on reducing fatal interactions between law enforcement and marginalized communities. My brother, Shay Taylor, was killed in 2016. He was deeply loved by his family and his community. We have participated in his inquest as a family, and as a result of us participating in that inquest, we wanted to push for a more fair, equitable inquest process. I had the pleasure also of serving on the Executive's Review Committee. As a community member, I continue to push for positive reforms in the inquest process. And as we continue to work with families who have lost loved ones to police violence through the Not This Time community. I'm grateful for the leadership of the Review Committee and of the community coalition that came together, and as well as those members of law enforcement who came to the table to work collaboratively towards positive reforms. I also want to thank Executive Constantine for his leadership on this issue, and I know that this new process provide a more satisfactory experience for families and the broader community. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we had conversations with law enforcement throughout this review process, and I would like now to introduce James Shrimpshire, who is with the Fraternal Order of Police.
Hello, my name is James Shrimpshire. I represent the Washington State Fraternal Order of Police. I'm joined here today with our Executive Director, Lynette Buffington. The Washington State Fraternal Order of Police is 2,600 members, and we represent in King County alone 15 collective bargaining units. I too want to thank Executive Director Constantine for allowing us to be part of this process. This is yet another example of law enforcement and the community, as well as other interested stakeholders coming together to work collaboratively on an issue. So this is how you solve problems, working together. So we appreciate being allowed to be a part of that process. And again, I want to thank everyone that took part in it. And we believe that having this process focused on policy is the best for our members. And again, thank you.
Thank you. And as I also mentioned, beyond our review committee, we worked with a community coalition, and here representing the community coalition is Diane Narasaki.
Thank you, Executive Constantine. As Executive Constantine said, my name's Diane Narasaki. I'm Executive Director of Asian Counseling and Referral Service, or ACRS, and co-chair of APIC, the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition. Last year, we met with Executive Constantine along with other community leaders and members and urged him to review and reform the county's inquest process. We knew that many involved in past inquests were deeply unsatisfied with the process. We saw that structurally the inquest process was flawed and unbalanced, and heard that the hearings felt one-sided in favor of law enforcement and painfully unsatisfactory for families who had lost their loved ones. We had just lost a young member of our community and wanted to make sure that the fact-finding inquiry into the circumstances of his death was fair and accessible to his family members and the broader community. We wanted to be sure that this would be so for all other families involved in inquests in the future. The executive answered a call to action from us and a coalition of 24 community organizations and leaders from all communities of color and the broader community. He worked with us over the course of last year to hear community recommendations on how the inquest process could be reformed and modernized. I'm glad to stand here today with members of our community coalition, members of law enforcement, the Executive's Review Committee, and other stakeholders as we usher in a new era of transparency in the county's inquest process. King County is the only jurisdiction in Washington State where an inquest is held. The process is unique because it's public. It's a public inquiry into the facts and circumstances of the death of a civilian at the hands of law enforcement. I'm proud of the work that we've accomplished together with all of the stakeholders to provide a greater fairness to all of the parties involved in the process. I want to thank Executive Constantine for his leadership and collaboration with the community on these reforms, as well as all of our coalition members and law enforcement and all the families and advocates who have called for justice and inquest reforms over the years. Thank you.
As I mentioned, we also had conversations with our cities along the way. You see, that it is the cities ultimately that are responsible for local law enforcement. And when we, in this new process, have a jury finding that the officer did not follow the policies and the training, or a finding that, while the officer did follow the policies and the training, we nevertheless had this tragedy occur, we will then need the local jurisdiction that's in charge of policing, which could be the county in the unincorporated area, or it could be a city, to look inward, examine what they are doing, and ask the question, what can be done to prevent this from happening in the future? I'm very pleased to introduce to you a regional leader, a Renton City Council member, Ed Prince.
Thank you, Executive Constantine. My name is Ed Prince, and I'm the Renton City Council President. I also serve as the Sound Cities Association Public Issues Committee Chair. I'm here today to stand with Executive Constantine as he signs a new executive order on inquest into law. As an elected official, it's important to me that the members of my community trust in the inquest process. It is also important to me that law enforcement and the communities they so bravely serve can build trust and understanding across differences, and I believe these reforms will help accomplish that. This new process is an opportunity to engender public trust in the inquest process. It is a strong example of what can happen when local government, community members, and law enforcement members come together to make constructive change. I want to thank all the stakeholders in the room today who worked collaboratively on these reforms. I also want to thank Executive Constantine for his leadership on reforming the inquest process in King County and for working with city officials and law enforcement to develop these reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I Before I sign the new executive order, I wanted to see if there are any questions for either me or the other folks who have spoken today. Yes, please go ahead.
I think of a department like Seattle Police that has its own internal review of shootings. How would the inquest process sort of interact with individual departments' own review process?
There are additional processes, including within the county, that look into similar, at least overlapping questions about policy and training. But this information, including the findings of the jury, the investigatory materials, et cetera, will be available to each jurisdiction so that they can examine what could be done better. It is without question that there may from time to time be a situation where deadly force, the last resort, is used or must be used. But we want to reduce to the absolute minimum the number of occasions when that is true. We should not have policies and training that put us in a position of having to use deadly force. We should not be putting ourselves in a position of having a police officer have to make that split-second decision. We should not be putting ourselves in a position where a family is grieving rather than attempting to find out how their loved one got into trouble and to begin a restorative process. I believe that this new inquest process puts us in a better position to be able to make that kind of progress, because in each case, in every single case, we should be asking, what could have been done to prevent this? What can be done better in the future? How can we make sure that the next time there is an interaction, it doesn't end in tragedy? I think that we are putting ourselves in a strong position to do that. It is the jurisdictions themselves that are going to have to wrestle with that question. The jury is simply going to come to the finding of whether the training was followed, what the policies were, and whether the training was followed.
And real quick, Diane, you mentioned a community member. Can you just say who you're referring to?
Tommy Lee.
Are there others?
To clarify, the inquests that were paused early this year as this process played out, those are going to be rebooted post?
Yes, so we'll begin those. We think it's going to take some time to get the structures set up. There will be some internal administrative structures. We have to identify a pool of what would effectively been the district court judges to manage each inquest. So that work is going to take us the last quarter of this year. And so in the first quarter of next year, we can begin the inquests again. I know that it is difficult for the families waiting this amount of time, but I also know that many of the families ask that we have a process that ultimately was more satisfactory to them, and that helps us create the conditions where other families won't have to grieve as they are grieving. Yes.
With the inquest process, one of the issues seemed to be a perception that there was some sort of verdict being reached.
Yeah.
Does this, just to be clear, that if there is a finding that this was out of policy, are there any consequences tied to that finding? Or
no, this is not, again, a trial. It is simply for the jury to find that fact. Was this consistent with policy or the training? Previously, one of the real challenges we had was that each inquest seemed to lead to a conclusion that the officer feared for their life, and and then that would be sort of translated in the press into the public as the shooting or the death was justified. That is not what the inquest process is about. And so we want to get to facts that are actionable by jurisdictions that are in charge of policing to reduce the number of tragedies. It is about neither convicting nor exonerating the officer.
Mr. Executive, where else did you look for guidance besides the folks that we see behind you and the folks in this room? Specifically, are there other municipalities working with similar issues?
So I'm going to let some of the folks who served on our review committee discuss where else they looked around, not just the country, but the continent, I believe, for models for this kind of investigation. You're up. Madam Vice Chair. Co-chair.
So we looked at Ontario, Canada, and Toronto, where they have an inquest process that is we looked at some of the things that they did and tried to incorporate them into what we wanted to recommend that be reviewed for the inquest process here. We also looked at some other areas in the country that have something similar. Although I believe King County is the only one in the country that has a public hearing. So, so we did do a thorough research on what we were recommending. Did that answer the question for you? Okay.
And, you know, since you mentioned it being public, we're also being clearer in this executive order that these proceedings are public and are open to the public as well as to the press as the eyes and ears of the public, so that we don't have any ambiguity with the presiding officers in these about who is allowed to come and observe. Others? Would you join me as I sign this? Please, yes. Everyone who's worked on this, gather around.
Looking good.
So I'm about to sign the executive order creating a new inquest process for King County. It was 3rd. And it's done. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Where